Some of the biggest questions that people have about the Christian faith surround the events of Easter. Can we be confident that the events that are recorded in the Gospels are actually historically accurate? How can a man who has been crucified in violence be at the heart of the plan of a loving God? Why would he allow that to happen? And of course, most of all, did Jesus actually rise from the dead? And what difference does that make? Now, those are very valid questions for any skeptic to ask. I want to try and give you some answers. And the question I want to deal with in this first Easter for Skeptics video is the Easter story historically reliable? Can we trust the gospel accounts of Jesus? Now, many Bible scholars in the 20th century said no. They distinguished between the Jesus of history, the man who actually lived, and the Christ of faith. They said that the Jesus of Nazareth was a good rabbi, a remarkable preacher who gathered people around him, and a great movement followed him. He preached against the hypocrisy of the religious Pharisees, the religious establishment, and he preached very powerfully about the end of the world and warned people of that. He thought that the end of the world was very imminent. And then, because he was a troublemaker, they crucified him and he died. And they did away with him. And then they say, well, that was the Jesus of history. The Christ of faith is a much later idea. His movement grew and spread, and 200 or 300 years later, that movement imposed back onto Jesus of Nazareth ideas that he never himself taught. So, for example, the claim that he was the Son of God, and the miracles that he performed, and the very fact that he rose from the dead is a fact imposed back onto the story, they say, rather than something that actually happened. And so they are, if you like, inventing a myth that is superimposed on top of a historical character. And these Bible scholars argued that in a scientific age, we have to demythologize the gospel stories, to take away anything that requires a faith in the supernatural. So, for example, Jesus walking on water, or raising Lazarus from the dead, or his own resurrection. These things, they said, we have to take away, and also any brutal, primitive idea that Jesus was paying the price of our sin through the sufferings of his death. Now, if that is the case, if we accept that hypothesis, you would then have to say that when we come to the Gospels, they would have a mythical style about them, that they would read like legend. And legend is a particular sort of literature style. There would be fanciful names, and there would be a stark divide between good and evil, between the heroes and the villains of the story. With Jesus heroically convincing all his followers of everything that he taught, and they all sort of instantly follow him because he's the great hero. And there would be great success stories built around his followers as well. C.S. Lewis taught English literature at Oxford University, and he said this about the biblical narratives. I have been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, myths all my life. I know what they are like. I know that not one of them is like this. In other words, he's saying, look, either the gospel accounts are reportage, a narrative, a realistic account, historically reliable, or somebody sat down 200 or 300 years later to write a work of realistic fiction, not a work of myth or legend. And they did that even though nobody in the ancient world ever did that. And they did it 1,500 years before anybody else invented what we now know as the modern novel. And C.S. Lewis said, no, that's not possible. When we actually come to read the Gospels, we get a very historical account. This is not myth. These accounts are written with very accurate details. The names of the characters are the names of the time, and we know that from the findings of modern archaeology. The geography of the different places that Jesus goes to is very accurately recorded. And some of that information would not have been available to someone writing 300 years later. This is only possible if you've been talking to eyewitnesses. And we can know that today because we have the findings of modern archaeology, but somebody writing in the 3rd or 4th century would not have had that information. So when we come to Matthew, Mark and Luke, they give us eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. Each of them is quite different. They've talked to different eyewitnesses. They've each got a different theological purpose and a different emphasis, and yet they all converge in telling the same story. They are not going off in wildly different directions. There's one coherent picture of one coherent Jesus. And yes, John's Gospel is very different to Matthew, Mark and Luke. But there are also hints that he knows that his readers have already got at least one of the other Gospels. He doesn't bother to tell them what happened at the trial in the Jewish council. He simply says they took Jesus in there and then he came out again. He knows that his readers will have read that in one of the other Gospels. He records other miracles. For example, Jesus turning the water into wine and Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. You won't find those in the other 3 Gospels, and yet they don't conflict with the picture of what happens in the other Gospels. And he records miracles that the other Gospel writers include, like feeding the 5,000. All of them give a very clear, meticulously recorded account of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And we can be confident that they were writing their Gospels within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of these events. In fact, Matthew and John were themselves eyewitnesses. They were disciples of Jesus, and therefore they write their accounts based on what they themselves have witnessed. Who did Jesus think he was? Was he just a young preacher who set out to preach and then lost control of his life as the movement ran away with him? No, certainly not. Jesus is very much in charge of everything that happens in his life and in all the events that lead up to his death and resurrection. And he predicted his death and resurrection very reliably and very clearly. There is a realism about the character of Jesus that could not be a work of fiction. The Scottish theologian Donald MacLeod put it like this: "There is no record in the whole of literary history of a community creating a figure comparable to Christ. Such grandeur, such compassion, such magnificent teaching, so good and yet so credible, so divine and yet so human, so real that the narrative totally convinces us that if we came to him, we would find rest for our souls." We can only make sense of Jesus as recorded in the Gospels as we realize that all the way through his ministry, he knows that he is heading to his cross. And he explains that to his disciples. And if you were writing a work of fiction, you wouldn't record some of the conversations that we have recorded for us in the Gospels because of the way that they show his disciples to be incredibly dim. So, for example, in Mark chapter 8, Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." This is how people were trying to explain Jesus away. But then Jesus says, "But what about you? Who do you say I am?" And Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." That is, you are the Christ, God's chosen, anointed deliverer. You see, the disciples had been with Jesus for all that time. They'd heard everything he'd taught, listened to all his parables and sermons. They'd seen his miracles. And as they looked at all of that, they said, there's only one conclusion we can reach. He must be the Messiah that we have been waiting for. Now, if that was a work of fiction, you wouldn't go on, as Mark does, to record what happens after that. Jesus went on to tell them, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed and after 3 days rise again." Jesus knew that he was going to die, and he was very direct with his disciples, but they were scandalized, and Peter took him aside and rebuked him and said, "We're never going to let that happen. I'm not going to let you die." And Jesus rebuked Peter in front of all the other disciples. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. Now, why would Mark, who was a disciple of Peter, record the great founder of the Christian church, Peter, who led the other apostles? Why would he record him saying something like that and Jesus calling him Satan? You wouldn't include a detail like that unless it was historical. And time and again in the Gospels, Jesus predicts his death and the disciples just don't get it. They do not understand where this story is going. And the Gospel writers record that because they know it shows the historical authenticity of the story that they're writing. Now, at the Last Supper in that upstairs room in Jerusalem where Jesus and his disciples met to celebrate the feast of the Passover, Jesus made quite clear that he knew ahead of time who was going to betray him. And he was referring to Judas, of course. And he said to his disciples, this is how Mark puts it, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." And the disciples just didn't get it. They're all looking at each other. Is it me? Am I the one? And they're all terribly troubled by this. These are the men who are going to lead the movement that will flow from the death and resurrection of Jesus. And yet Mark records very faithfully how completely nonplussed they are. They don't look like the kind of leaders you would hope for, do they? And why would you include that unless it actually happened? And Mark is giving us a historical account. Lastly, have you ever thought about this? If you were founding a great religious movement, why would you put at the center of it such a basic, simple sign as the Lord's Supper? So Jesus took two symbols, bread and wine, and used them to be the symbols of his death. You think about it, so many religions have invented elaborate rituals with, amazing glory and ceremony and gold and silver and diamonds and all the rest of it. And Jesus just takes bread and wine and makes them the symbols of his movement. The bread represents his body. Jesus himself never taught that it would miraculously turn into his own body. He's saying simply, this bread represents my body. This cup, this wine represents my blood, to remind us that his death was all about paying the price for our sin. And it was no accident. It was the clear plan of God. And therefore, right at the heart of Christianity is the cross of Jesus. And the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper as we now call it, reminds us that that is the very heart of our faith. Jesus dying in our place. When we read the Gospels, the Jesus that they record is so obviously in control of all his destiny. And his words and his acts are so surrounded by such accurate historical detail. And indeed, the character of Jesus himself is so compelling that we cannot write this off as a mere creation of fiction. It would be impossible to do that. And that becomes even more obvious when we come to the details of his trial, which we will look at in our second episode. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll look forward to seeing you then.